Well, good evening, everyone. You can see on the screen behind me, there's five things I want to work through tonight. The left behind concept, the Old Testament tribulation language, and then the abomination of desolation. What is that actually in Matthew and Luke 21? Then I want to compare ongoing tribulation with the great tribulation. And finally, I want to talk to you about how God actually uses tribulation in our life. So with that in mind, we'll start a screen share here. And let's just begin and walking through the sequence. So we're talking about this time frame. You can see it marked in red uh, on a premillennial, pre-tribulation timeline or system. You can see that it occurs in a 7-year period. That 7-year period is not actually biblical support, but I want you to see that's the period of great tribulation typically that people refer to. In an amillennial, you'll see it's here on a different scale, but it's right before the return of Christ. It involves an antichrist revealing. It involves a great apostasy or a falling away, and ultimately a great tribulation of believers. So that's the framework of Matthew 24 and the great tribulation that I want to explain tonight. Now, this is the temple in Jerusalem that Jesus walked in. Some of you have been in Jerusalem. You've been on the Temple Mount. This is an amazing place because all the stones were cut perfectly, so there's no mortar or cement to connect them. They're just stacked and interlocked almost like a Legos. This thing is about 1,000 feet by 500. I mean, it's huge. It's multiple football fields. And the stones are large. The average stones weigh about 40 tons. The largest stone in it weighed over 570 tons. And Jesus had just left the temple and he was moving on from here. And this is where he said to his disciples, there's coming a day where not one stone will be left on top of another. And if you can imagine the disciples looking at these humongous 500-ton stones, they couldn't comprehend it. So in AD 70, when the Romans came in and seized Jerusalem, the Roman soldiers assumed that the Jews had taken their gold and silver and melted it in the cracks of the temple to hide it. And so there's no mortar between these stones. And so they assumed that all this gold and silver was between the rocks. And so that's why they literally tore every rock down, one after the other. They were looking for gold. They were looking for silver. And so that prophecy actually came through in AD 70. So Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are centered around the temple and Jesus just teaching there and referencing that. And as he sat across the valley, looked across and saw the temple, this is the context we come to in Matthew 24, excuse me, Matthew 24 and Luke 21. So I want to start with the left behind because I think we've misinterpreted this pretty badly. Are those taken in these scriptures, are they taken to salvation like we assumed, or are they taken to judgment? We assume that those taken, one's taken, one's left, that the taken are the rapture. And those that are left are the evil people. So let's actually take a look at the scriptures and see if that's what it says. So here's Matthew. In that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, except the Father alone. For just like the days of Noah, here's the comparison, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. In those days, before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and took them all away. Keep that in mind. Who was taken away? Was Noah taken away? Or were the people that were left taken away? It will be the same at the coming of the Son of Man. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one was left. There will be two women grinding grain with a mill, one will be taken and one is left. Who's taken and who's left? Here it is in Luke, and look at that at the bottom. Two people in bed one night, one will be taken, the other left. 35, there will be two women grinding grain, exact same reference that we have in Matthew 24. The question we have to ask is, who's taken and who's left? So to understand that, let's go to the Old Testament first. What was the concept of judgment in the Old Testament concerning taken and left? Isaiah 4. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life. The people that are left in Zion are the holy ones, not the ones that were taken. Who's taken? Verse 4. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of burning. In the Old Testament, if you were taken away by judgment. If you were left for salvation. Here it is in Zephaniah. On that day you shall not be put to shame because of the deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proudly exalted ones, and you shall no longer be haughty in my holy mountain. But who do I leave? I leave in your midst a people humble and lowly. In the Old Testament, it's clear. If you were taken for judgment. If you were left for salvation. So back to Matthew. Just like in the days of Noah is one of the comparisons. And they knew nothing until the flood came and took them away. They were taken away by judgment. That's an Old Testament concept. Jesus is simply repeating what the Old Testament taught. So for this reason, we're looking at Matthew 24 and Luke 17 to demonstrate that the teachings of Jesus concerning being taken away and one being left behind are couched in prophecy that stresses God's judgment, not salvation. So the comparison is the days of Noah, the days of Lot, and the destruction of Jerusalem. So it will be when the Son of Man returns. Many, because they are unprepared, will be taken away to destruction, whereas those left behind will receive grace and salvation. That's the unique difference. However, a pre-millennial, pre-tribulational system has misinterpreted this to say those that are left behind are the ones that aren't saved. God comes and raptures, takes out those who are saved, and leaves behind the evil ones. But that's not the clear teaching of the passage. So when we look at this, we find in the Old Testament and the New Testament that a picture of God's judgment of the ungodly being taken away while the righteous are left behind. That seems to be the pattern. That pattern's found in Matthew, it's found in Luke, it's found in Isaiah, it's found in Jeremiah. So let's take a look at the actual language. Paralambano is the Greek to be taken away. It's the word Jesus uses here. And in the New Testament, it's used in three ways. It's positive, it's negative, and sometimes it's just neutral. And the context determines whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. It's negative in John 19 and Matthew 27, where the soldiers came, it says, and took Jesus away to crucify him. They took him away for judgment. Okay. That seems to be the context we have in Matthew 24. However, in John 14, here's a positive one. Jesus says, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to be with me. He didn't say I'll gather you, he said I'll take you. So there's same paralambano used in a positive way. The context determines whether it's positive or negative. So Matthew 24, he will send his angels with a loud trumpet and they will gather his elect. Gather his elect. What's that look like? Is that the taking away? No, it's not the taking away, because look at verse 40 of the same chapter. Jesus says, one will be taken and one left. We have gathering and we have being taken, and they are not the same thing. Unfortunately, the premillennial system has made them the same thing. Matthew 24, 31, gathered. Matthew 24, 40, taken away. And interestingly, the verb used to describe in Matthew 13, 30, which is the parable of the weeds, then it's an interesting thing. Let me show you this in that particular passage in Matthew 13. I want you to see that, when we're in, we'll just pull this up real quick. I thought I was going to do it quick. I'm not that quick tonight. All right, so here's the parable of the weeds starting in verse 24. Here's another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a person who sowed good seed in his field, but while he was sleeping, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the plant sprouted and bore grain, then the weeds appeared. So the slaves or servants came to him and said, didn't you sow good seed? He said, yeah. Where'd the weeds come from? Well, an enemy has done this. In this parable, the enemy is Satan. So the servants replied, do you want us to go and gather them? In other words, do you want us to pull the weeds? No, he said, because when you pull the weeds, you'll probably uproot some of the wheat. In this parable, the weeds are evil, the wheat is righteous. Let both grow together until the harvest. When's the harvest? Return of Jesus. At harvest time, I will tell the reapers. Now we're back to that Matthew 24 gathered, Matthew 24:31. First collect the weeds. First gather the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat. Who is first to be taken in this parable? The weeds, not the wheat. Judgment comes first and then salvation. We've read that parable, but we've never really connected it to what Jesus talks about in Matthew 24, which is primarily where that connection comes. And so now when we're back to understanding what takes place here, you've got a whole different scenario taking place in the gathering and the being taken away. So let's move on through it. 24:38. In those days before the flood, Noah taken away. Noah was left. All the evil or sinners were taken away. Genesis 7, he blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, not taken. Only Noah was left. Salvation comes to those that are left, not to those who are taken. Those who are taken in judgment. So back here, just real quickly, let me finish this up. So if we're talking here about the left behind concept, who's taken and who's left, the clear teaching of Scripture is that the ones that are taken for judgment. The ones that are left for salvation. So that gives you a perspective that all of a sudden, the whole left behind mindset that kind of stuck on our brain about this system is not really biblical. It's not the clear teaching of Scripture. You have to force that into the system to make that being taken connect with Thessalonians 4 of a rapture. And so I want you to understand that that's not accurate. So with that in mind, I want you to look at an Old Testament tribulation language, because this comes from Petrie's doctoral research. The second temple time frame was the writing of the scholars who lived between the years 500 BC to 0 BC. That's the second temple period. And during that period of time, the temple was in Jerusalem. It wasn't operating like it should have been. There was all kinds of problems. Israel and Judah were still under Gentile rule. But the scholars looked through their Bible, the Old Testament, and these are the tribulation connections that they wrote about. This is what they believed about the tribulation long before Jesus ever arrived on the scene. One, it's tied to the restoration of Israel and the end of exile. Was Israel still in exile when Jesus was here? This is a tough question, because we tend to think the exile was over, but the people that lived in Jesus' day didn't. Second Temple writers didn't. Judah had returned from Babylon. The temple had been rebuilt, but none of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, Israel, had returned. They were still in exile. So when Jesus arrived on the scene, his disciples asked him, the religious leaders asked him, is now the time you're going to restore the kingdom? Is now the time you're going to end the exile? So tribulation in Old Testament, Second Temple writers was tied to the restoration and the end of the exile constantly. By the way, did the exile end in Acts chapter 2? I want to talk briefly about that next week. On the day of Pentecost, when Israelites were gathered from all over the planet and Peter preached and many came to know Christ, was that the end of exile? Yeah, it's possible. We'll look at that next week. So 2, a righteous remnant arises during the tribulation. By the way, when you see these are all connected as well to New Testament concepts. We can find all of these. The New Testament writers took the Old Testament concepts and folded them into their writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. 3, the righteous suffer and or die during the tribulation. This sometimes includes a messianic figure. The tribulation is tied to the coming of a Messiah. Son of Man reference. That's all New Testament as well. The tribulation precedes final judgment. Very clear in terms of the order in the New Testament. The tribulation has 2 stages. This is interesting. There's a preliminary stage, and then there's a great tribulation. Very much a part of what the New Testament writers teach. The tribulation precedes the coming of an end time kingdom. Yep. Find that all over in the New Testament. An end time tyrant, opponent, or anti-Messiah arises during the tribulation, or multiple ones, according to 1 John. Yep, we find that in the New Testament. Typological images from the Old Testament are used to depict the tribulation. Yeah, what Israel went through and faced in exile and all these, yeah, that goes right into the New Testament writers. The tribulation is tied to the ingathering or conversion of Gentiles. Yep, that's right there. You wouldn't expect that coming out of, Old Testament, but the Old Testament was clear that Gentiles are going to be merged in to the kingdom. The tribulation has some kind of atoning or redemptive function. I want to talk about this when we close today, when we talk about how God uses tribulation in our lives. The Jerusalem temple is defiled and or destroyed. Yeah, we kind of have that assumption. In fact, Matthew 24, we'll look at next week. Jesus says this temple's not going to be here. It's going to be destroyed. Is that during tribulation? Yes. Is it during great tribulation? Probably not. And then the tribulation precedes the resurrection and or new creation. So the resurrection of the dead at the return of Jesus, the tribulation precedes that. And then we'll look next at this concept of how do we know that fits into the sequence of where we're going. So here's the question. Matthew 24. When is it going to happen? So they're walking out of the temple and Jesus is sitting looking across the valley, and the disciples come to him and say, tell us when these things will be. When's all this going to happen? And look at the question. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, Jesus' coming and the end of the age are tied together, correct?
Mm-hmm.
See that? So they're the same time frame. Okay, now make sure that that's there. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Luke 21, they asked him saying, teacher, when will these things happen and what will be the sign? Does Jesus give them a sign? Yes, he gives them a number of signs. If you're interested, we can look at those next week, because I think that's one of the keys for us interpreting what's actually happening in the world today. We need to know the signs. We don't have a time frame, but we do have some signage that Jesus points to. So the disciples ask him when. So I want you to see that when we're looking at this, Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are identical. Okay. They're talking about being delivered up to tribulation here in verse 9, all that goes on, nation rise against nation, wars, insurrections, don't be terrified. All these things are happening. And he says this same thing in both locations. And the reason I want you to know that is because Luke is going to help us understand what Matthew's talking about, also what Daniel's talking about. So the abomination of desolation, most of you are familiar with this phrase if you are pre-tribulational, because the abomination of desolation, we have been taught, is someone gets up in the temple and sacrifices a pig and desecrates the temple. Some desecration of the temple, so the temple has no longer any valid way of being used. So Nebuchadnezzar desolated the temple. He tore it down. We had a new temple built back along 515 BC. Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Greek leaders, came in and he kind of desecrated the temple, and everybody said, well, that's what this is. This is a specific time. So here's Jesus. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, Daniel 12, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Luke says of that event, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Luke says that the abomination of desolation is the desolation of the temple and Jerusalem and the destruction of the city. It's not just a desecration of a temple. So in my mind, people that studied, premillennial said, well, we have to have a temple rebuilt in Jerusalem because it has to be desolated. This abomination of desolation has to happen, and you have to have a physical temple. But if the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, and Jesus describes it in Luke as the destruction of Jerusalem, that did happen in AD 70. It's very clear. That's over. It was a prophecy of Jesus because it was 40 years later for Jesus, but it happened in AD 70. It's history for us. The abomination of desolation is no longer a reality. It's an already but still to come kind of a thing. So that's why when you get to this abomination of desolation, it's already happened. For many of you, the question you have to answer, do we have to have a new temple built so this can happen again? That's the real question for us in terms of how we function. So for me, I would say Jesus was very clear in Luke and describing that what he was talking about was the destruction of Jerusalem. And I want to show you that next week when we go section by section through Matthew, because you need to get an understanding, a feel for what that means in terms of signage about what's yet to come. So if I'm going to define tribulation versus great tribulation, what's it look like and how do I get the structure in there? What's the difference? So it's pretty clear that biblically, both Old Testament and New Testament, it's already here and it's still to come. It's both and. So here we go. So tribulation is already happening. Agreed? Yes, it's happening. You can't disagree with that. Believers are under oppression, more so today. I don't post on Facebook much, but I had to post early this morning. I never thought I would live to see the day when a Supreme Court nominee could not define what a woman is. I never thought I'd live to see that day. I mean, you talk about we are already under oppression. I mean, that's here. But there's a sense we're not yet. The end, the ultimate consummation of persecution, tribulation, still to come. It's a both and, or an already but still to come, or already happened and it's still coming. So let's take a look at how that comes. So in Revelation 3 and verse 10, because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth. Now, John was talking to an existing historical church in Revelation 3. This is an existing group of believers, and think about what he's saying. This is Jesus saying to this group of believers in this church, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming. Why does Jesus need to keep them from something that's going to happen 2,000, 4,000 years in the future? This tribulation was already there for them. The hour of trial that was coming was something they were experiencing, and Jesus promised, I'm going to keep you from it. I'm going to protect you from it. This was not something that was, thousands of years in the future when Jesus returns. This was already. Here we are in one part of Revelation. John's very clearly saying, this tribulation, it's happening. It's already there. There's no other way to interpret the fact that the hour of trial talked about is an already happening event.
But it says it's on the whole world there. What was on the whole world back then for this church?
What was the whole world? The hour of trial is coming on the whole world. Who were they facing?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
This was Nero. This was persecution throughout the entire Roman Empire by Emperor Nero.
Okay.
Their whole world. How big was their world, do you think?
But Jesus would have phrased it as the whole world, knowing that there was more than just that.
That was the whole world. The Roman Empire was the world of the day.
Okay.
I mean, that was conceptually, I mean, we didn't have globalists and all that kind of the concept of on the whole world. And I can take you to other points when we talk about that, how they conquered and went through that. And every one of the churches, he talks about it. But if you hang in there and conquer, you'll be given this, this, and this. The reality is that tribulation is already coming. It's already there. So he sits on the Mount of Olives. When will these things be? And he goes to this. And then in verse 9, he says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. That is the exact same frame. The word is identical. Tribulation, thlipsis. It's the exact same word. And the disciples, do you understand historically that all the disciples were persecuted? They all faced extreme tribulation. Some of them were martyred. But every one of them, so he says to them, Peter, James, John, they're going to deliver you up to tribulation and they'll put you to death. You'll be hated. This is not great tribulation. This is what's now. This is already here. And the disciples knew this was it was right there. I mean, even in the book of Acts, they're throwing them in jail. So this was not a future thing for Jesus to his disciples. This was right now. This is what's happening. And then he says there's going to be a great tribulation. Now here we have the modifier. Hence we have tribulation versus great tribulation. So what is it we know about this, what Jesus called a great tribulation? So for then there will be a great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world till now and never will be. Now there's a time frame and a geography given. And if those days had not been cut short, so there's a time length that he says it's going to be shorter than longer. No human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect believers, those days will be cut short. The time frame of great tribulation is not 7 years, but we're not given it other than the only time frame we're given is that it's going to be cut short. It could go longer, but God's going to cut it short. This is great tribulation. Revelation, John says, one of the elders, he's in heaven. One of the elders, who are these clothed in white robes? Where have they come from? And I said to him, sir, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. There it is again. John's talking about it. Revelation 7, Matthew 24, great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. These are those, he goes on to say, who have their name written in the Lamb's book of life. They came out of the great tribulation. They went through it. So now we have a modifier on this what is this great tribulation? Daniel talks about it too. Old Testament. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of Israel, your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. We're talking about a big one. Jeremiah. Alas, that day is so great, there is none like it. You see how now we have ongoing tribulation, but there's coming a time when it's going to be intensified. And the modifiers that are used are called great, a time like's never been, and it's a time of distress for Jacob, and yet he talks about Jacob being saved. This is Israel. So what is it that we know about the Great Tribulation? What can we actually say about it? It's linked in the Old Testament with Daniel 12 and Jeremiah. The Old Testament scholars and authors knew there was a great tribulation coming. They knew that they were facing tribulation. It was ongoing, but there was a bigger one yet to come. It connects Matthew and John. They both talk about it. Can we say the Great Tribulation is an accurate event based on Jesus' teaching? Yes, Jesus taught it. It's coming. John confirmed it when he was in heaven, and he saw these people that had come out of the Great Tribulation. We don't know what the time frame is, but we know it's real. We also know it's a time that precedes the final judgment. Final judgment, return of Jesus. It's from a time frame, it happens just before Jesus' return. It's not something that's going to be long, this is close to the end. This is like everything kind of getting up and it gets to a boil and right before it boils over, Jesus returned. This is where we are. Okay. And John puts it at that reference. Jesus talks about it's happening right before the return of the Son of Man. This is an important concept of when Great Tribulation takes place. Remember, tribulation is ongoing. It's already here. But the event of greatness or maximum tribulation comes right before Jesus returns. It involves the persecution of believers regardless of ethnicity. Okay, this is the human race, but it's a persecution of all believers. Now, as you go through and look at that kind of persecution, what does that persecution involve? It has one purpose, and that's to get a person to deny faith in Christ. Renounce your faith in Christ. That's the one purpose. What are the means that are used to get that person to deny Christ?
Anything.
I mean, it's from everything up to death. Okay. Hebrews 11 talks about that great hall of faith and people sawn in two, and they were referring to Isaiah. Isaiah was actually hiding from a very evil king and he crawled into a hollow log to hide, and they found him and took a saw and cut the log in half. That's how he died. So you've got this issue of persecution up to death, persecution all the way to death. And it's going to be intense. And there's not one believer that will miss persecution, some level of tribulation. There is no time frame other than short. It's going to be shortened. That's the only thing we know about it. It's going to be shortened. So there's no time frame. So, if we go back here to slide 2 and talk about, where we thought this was a 7-year, the location of great tribulation in this time frame is correct, right in through here. That's the correct, because it's right before the return of Jesus. But there is no evidence that it's going to be 7 years in duration. It could be shorter than that. It could be, we don't know. All we know is that Jesus says it's going to be cut short because of the grace of God. It's going to be cut short. So with that, I want to take you to a couple of things about the church here in Revelation. So this is the church in Revelation, and he's talking to these different churches. And look here at verse 5 of the church to Sardis. The one who conquers will be dressed like them in white clothing, and I will never erase his name from the book of life. The one who conquers. How does somebody conquer? Look at the church of Philadelphia, verse 12. The one who conquers, I will make a pillar. How do you conquer? What are you conquering? He's talking, as you go through there, he's talking about this endurance of how they have to go through and what's going to take place. Laodicea. Okay. He talks about the one, I will grant the one who conquers permission to sit with me on my throne. Every one of these churches. And you go back through, even in chapter 2, when he's talking about the church, every single church, he says, there's a conquering feature to what happens here. So, if I asked you, what are you conquering? It's a legitimate question, isn't it? What are we conquering now? What are we going to have to conquer?
Isn't it steadfastness, Greg? I mean, we're conquering all the evil that's around us, and we're staying steadfast in our belief.
Okay, so there is some steadfastness to it, but let's think through. Let me get back to that slide. What if I said specifically, what is it that you're going to conquer? What would you say you're conquering?
Perseverance. You're persevering.
What do we conquer as Christians? What are we out to conquer?
Satan.
Satan.
Okay, Satan to some degree.
Denouncing Christ.
We're conquering all of those that want, as she said, that want us to denounce Christ.
Okay, but now if I'm doing that, I can't do it, Coke, unless I remain steadfast, faithful. To remain faithful and steadfast, what do I have to conquer?
Temptation.
Self.
I got to conquer sin, don't I?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me to remain faithful to Christ, don't I have to conquer some things in my life? And aren't there individual unique things that we have to conquer if we're going to remain faithful? Do you think that persecution, tribulation, I don't care however you want to couch it, do you think that will not be specific and unique to each one of us? Do you think that Satan and his minions will not focus on the weakest parts of us?
It'll be specifically targeted at us.
That's what I mean. It's like targeted advertising is now. I mean, Paul, it's like you getting shingles commercials on your phone. I mean, it's that kind of thing where, so what are we conquering? Think about this. We have to conquer specific things And we need to understand what spiritual maturity is to pull that off. You don't beat sin without knowing spiritual disciplines. Conquering sin is not for immature Christians. Immature Christians do a lot of repenting and confession. A mature Christian should be doing less confession as they're maturing, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is to remain faithful and not yield to temptations, and to be able to conquer and lead through those. If we are not prepared for that and thinking in that stance, where are we going with it? I mean, where do we end up with this? I think it moves us to a whole different path. So, read back through that Revelation part again about what the conquering looks like, because conquering is directly tied to the way we handle tribulation, especially if we're around for the big one. Now, I think we all hope that we're not around for it. I think that would be our desire, right?
Yep.
But if we are, then we got to deal with it. So with that in mind, here's how God uses tribulation. Five ways. He uses trials or tribulation to break our independence and foster our dependence upon him. 2 Corinthians. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the tribulation we experienced in Asia, for we were utterly burdened beyond our strength, and we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. How about that? I mean, hey, I'm telling you, Paul was one of the most depressed preachers ever. I mean, he was always saying, I'm ready to go. I'm sick of this. I'm ready to go. And look at this. This was the very word Jesus used, thlipsis, great tribulation Jesus talked about. He told the disciples they'll face tribulation. Paul said when we experienced it, God used it to break our independence and foster dependence. One of the ways we conquer is what? Learning dependence on God. How do you learn to depend on God?
You're forced to.
You're forced to, right? I mean, if you pray for patience, what's God going to send you? Is he going to send you patience?
No.
No, he's going to send you more tribulation. He's going to put you out driving on 465 all day long. It's one of those kind of things. But listen, this is one of the keys for us understanding how do we get through. If we're facing tribulation and we're facing it, we know it's already here. It's going to come in a greater degree. We better get better at this, and we better check our levels of dependence. I think it's a great prayer on a daily basis to say, God, show me dependence today. Show me what I've got to depend on you for today. And we walk away from that, independence, which is built into our American way of life. And we say, what do I need to depend on you? I've said this before, and someone said it a long time ago. It's one of the greatest statements of faith ever. We don't need God if we never attempt the impossible. We don't need him. And that's this part right here. Paul said, I got to have him. If I don't have him, and how did Paul learn this? The hard way. The really hard way. Okay. Second, God uses trials to purify our faith and develop moral character. Would you agree that if I am going to face tribulation to the point of being forced to forsake my faith in Christ, I better have some depth of moral character? I better have my faith purified. Paul says this in Romans. Not only that, we rejoice in our tribulations, knowing that our suffering, tribulation, same word, produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. There's no shortcut to understand. If we don't face tribulation, we don't get deep moral character. And here's one of my concerns, and it's been a long time concern with the American church. The American church has lived predominantly a life of ease with very shallow moral character. That's the result. We've not developed moral character. We've never had to. I mean, we've had some personal trials and stuff, but overall, it's like as a group of believers in the United, this is probably the first time in our history in the United States where Christians are having to stand up and go, man, I better take something seriously here because it's getting messed up big time. Am I going to let that go, or am I going to step up and say something about it? And if I step up and say something about it, what's going to happen? I mean, most of you know I'm teaching at a university, and you get an email from the president, and he concludes it with the pronouns you use to refer to him. Here's my pronouns. It's like, okay, is that okay? I mean, really? I mean, at some point, we are on the verge as a nation of Christians in this nation where we're gonna have to do something. And quite honestly, it may result in higher levels of tribulation. Now, I'm not like one of those monks in the medieval times that went out looking for trouble so you get purified. But at the same point, we better be awake and know that it's probably coming. God uses trials or tribulation to test, prove, and strengthen our faith. Paul said, or Peter says this, in this you rejoice. Notice the second time rejoicing. You've been grieved by various trials, tribulation, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Let me ask you a question. Are there people that are going to stand before Jesus Christ that will be found to not cause praise and glory and honor? That made it in by the skin of their teeth, but their faith was not very pure? How pure does your faith have to be to make it? I will just tell you this. I don't want to be at the back of the line.
No.
Okay. I'm not going to be standing there waiting to listen to everybody else's thing. And then, okay, what am I back here with all these losers for? Right. I mean, I don't want to be there. And if this is what it requires to strengthen in my faith, I think this should be a deep desire on the heart of every maturing Christian that says, is my faith deep enough to bring honor and glory at that, when that day what's the revelation? That's his return. At the revelation of Jesus, will my faith result in praise, glory, and honor? Or will it result in, made it? I don't know. That's a tough one for me. Because I think it's one we're going to have to reckon with. God works through tribulation to prove himself powerful and reliable. And Paul said, he said to me, my grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect. Remember, this was the physical suffering Paul was working through. Most people scholars still think this was the fact that he was going blind and he had tremendous pain in his eyes. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, and tribulation and calamities. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. I believe that there are people that are going through tribulation, that will go through the great tribulation. And one of the things that will happen as a result of them surviving and living and being faithful through that is that God will prove himself so powerful to them that their experience of faith, the only way I can describe it is something that most people will think is unattainable. Picture a person who, in spite of suffering, depends on God so deep. Remember the first one about tribulation, it creates dependence on God. And they understand the power of God so powerfully in their life that they are living on a plane that is so far above everybody else that we just can't, they can't even talk to us about it. because it's so powerful in their life. God has connected, they have connected, and God has connected them in such a powerful way. Think of the strongest Christian in the world you can possibly think of. And this person here that experiences this would be 10, 20, 100 times higher in a relationship with God than they are. Because God works through trials to prove himself powerful and reliable. And when my faith gets to the point where I can trust him in every single thing, I mean, look at, I am content with weakness, insult, hardships, persecution, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Most of you are not old enough to remember Johnny Erickson, who became a quadriplegic after a diving accident as a teenager, and then went on to have a tremendous, testimony for God. And you would say, well, that's who's this is talking, a person like her, or a person like my brother who's been in bed for 20 plus years with polio and still loves God and work. This is an attainable thing, but it's something that can only happen through hardship and persecution and calamities. Not fun stuff to talk about, but it's what's happening. God uses trials to prove that our faith really works. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. For we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted. There it is. That's the tribulated. We are facing tribulation, but we are not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body of the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifest in our bodies. No matter where we end up physically, Paul says, Jesus is still going to work through me physically. It's just the way it is. We're afflicted in every way, but we're hanging in there. We're persecuted, but we're never forgotten, because God uses trials to prove that our faith works. And when we get back to those Revelation stories in chapter 2 and 3 of those churches, and he says, those who conquer are going to be here. In Revelation 12, Jesus says they overcame him, the enemy, by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. There you got it. Someone walks in your door and says, deny Christ and live. Don't deny him, die. They overcame him by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. And he goes on to say that they didn't love life so much as they feared death. So tribulation's here. We know it's here. We know it's coming. There's a big one coming. We don't have a time frame for it. We can't put a schedule on it. We know there's some signs. I'd like to show you those in Matthew 24 next week and walk you through it, where Jesus gives us clear signage, points the way. But we're going to face more and more tribulation. The good news is that God knows what he's doing and there's a purpose for it. The bad news is there seems to be no biblical evidence that any believer is going to escape tribulation as long as you're living. And if you happen to be alive prior to the return of Christ, it's going to be more intense. That's the clear teaching of the New Testament. It's going to be more intense. There's no getting away from it. And I wish we could all just get away from it. I wish, he would rescue us out of it and pull us out of it. But the clear teaching of the left behind statements are that the ones that are taken in judgment. The ones that are left behind are the ones that are here for salvation. So I don't think we get out of it. I think we go through it all of our lives, and it's to produce in us something that matters. And the biggest one for me is, when we get here, will my faith result in praise, glory, and honor? That should be a goal that we work at every single day. Okay. That my faith is tested, and your faith doesn't get tested without what? Tribulation. Something to test it. Faith cannot be tested arbitrarily. I don't wake up in the morning and create some exercise to test faith. Well, I do love riding motorcycles, so maybe I take that back. That may be one. But we don't intentionally try and say, well, I'm going to strengthen my faith today. It happens as life happens, and we face certain things that come into our path, and we need to have a goal, and that's the goal. 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. I just think that's something that's so remarkable that we can be there and have that in our lives. So, these are the kind of the things we want. The left behind, the ones left are the ones for salvation. The ones taken are taken in judgment. The Old Testament, they understood exactly what the New Testament was talking about. The abominations, the destruction of Jerusalem, that's over. That's AD 70. Tribulation versus Great Tribulation, it's already happening, and it's still going to come more. And how does God use it? He uses it in at least 5 ways, probably more than that, in at least 5 ways to purify our faith, to test our faith, and to get us to the point where we will be able to stand up and say, when our faith is tested, I will not deny him. I will not deny him. All right, questions for me?
If the abomination of desolation has already occurred completely, which I mean, I can understand that, but like you said, is there a third temple? Because, supposedly now the tribe of Aaron is making all of the temple stuff to put back in the temple when the temple is rebuilt. So what makes them do this? Just the hope that the temple will be rebuilt again?
Well, I think it's a national Jewish issue. It's not a religious issue. It's a political issue because who's on the Temple Mount, and the Temple Mount is is basically a conflict between Islam and Judaism, and it's a political issue. There is no purpose biblically for a reinstitution of the sacrifice. I mean, Hebrews is very clear. Sacrifices mean nothing for Jews or Gentiles. They're worthless. There's no reason to have Why do you need a temple if there's no purpose for sacrifice? And that was one of my internal struggles with premillennial.
Don't the Jews still feel that there's a need because the Messiah hasn't come for them?
No, they're not religious in that setting. I mean, they're not looking to reinstitute. There's very few people that are looking to reinstitute, a sacrificial system. The synagogue works perfectly well for Jews. They're perfectly settled. There may be some QAnon Jewish people that are looking for a temple thing, but it's not a big group by any means. And you're hearing less and less about that, and you're hearing more about an atheist Israel in the world today, an agnostic Israel, not a spiritual Israel at all. I mean, Israel's operating as just a pagan nation right now. So I purposely can't see biblically a need for another temple. And I don't see that coming in. I see Jesus' prophecy as the abomination of the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in AD 70. And it was very clear. And we'll look at Matthew 24 next week. And he says, flee. When you see that happening, go. Hope you're not pregnant and blah, blah, blah. He goes through all that in Matthew 24, and you can read it. But a lot of that, he's talking about what's already happening, what's going to happen, and then the future. And he makes a clear distinction about what's happening in Jerusalem and going to happen to Jerusalem and his return. And the key is being able to differentiate when he's talking about the end, his return, and when he's talking about just the destruction of Jerusalem. What else? How many of you got flipped on your head on the left behind concepts? Did that mess with your brain a little bit?
Yep.
Okay. So what's the principle that Jesus taught? If the ones that are taken for judgment, the ones that are left are the ones that are the holy ones. What's the principle we take away from that? Are the ones that are taken unawares? Yes. Yes. The principle is don't be unaware. Don't be foolish. Don't say you can put it off. Don't, don't slack on your spiritual disciplines. Don't take time off from your faith. You have to be aware that potential is that judgment's coming. There's no breaks from this. If you are a believer in Christ, you don't get a break. Okay. This is full-time, all the time awareness. Thief in the night illustration. And we'll talk about this next week. The thief in the night says, be aware. If you were aware he was coming, what would have happened? He wouldn't have got in because you were watching. And so the concept of there is, what do we have to be aware of? Now we go back to this whole issue of how do we build our faith? That's, how God uses tribulation. What does it do? How do we get faith that honors and glorifies Christ? That's the being aware part. And I think, I'm sorry, I have missed that for a long time, because I just thought, well, big deal. Why am I worried about the people that are left? I've already gone. I'm with that group. Let's go. Well, the reality is, if we're left behind, what are we facing? Tribulation. Okay. He's not rescuing us out of it. He's walking with us through it. There's a huge difference between let's get out of it and walk through it. Paul said he's
out.
Paul, I know we all want out, but Paul said he's walking through it with us. And here's the issue. If we don't go through some level of tribulation, and God knows what that is for each of us, our faith doesn't get purified, and we don't end up with that. We end up with at the back of the line instead of the front of the line of faith.
I have a question. If he's taking out all of the evil people for judgment, and we're left, and then we're going through tribulation, who's going to cause the tribulation?
Okay, but there's the mistake. It's not all of them.
Oh,
remember, there's two. One's taken, one's left. It's not everybody. This is not judgment for everybody. But there will be many people that are evil that will be judged and will die. They're taken out. They're gone.
But not all of
Oh, no, not even close.
them. Okay.
But should we be surprised now that a lot of people are going to be taken out in tribulation, in judgment, in God's judgment on people? No, God's going to judge people. There's going to people there. He's going to bring, when you go to the book of Revelation, there's over a fourth of humanity that's taken out in plagues and judgment of God in the book of Revelation. Okay. And that's what Jesus is referring to, that issue. But I want you to understand, don't make this like we're saved and gone and everybody else is the evil or left. We're here. There's still a lot of evil influence, a lot. Satan's still alive and well, and his whole army of what goes on with that. But the issue is we're not going to escape it. The people that are going to be missing in those equations are the people that God has judged for whatever reasons. Are there some people that are so evil right now that God's going to end their life? Yes. Yes.
Good. Yes.
Okay. And that's what he's taught. That's the judgment he's talking about. Take it back to the Old Testament with with Isaiah, when he talks about who's left in Jerusalem, the holy, the ones that disobeyed, God weaned them out. Does that mean that everybody that left there? No, there were still people there, but God took the worst of the worst. And that's what you see in the book of Revelation when he starts pouring out the bowls and the trumpets and all that kind of stuff. We see a vast amount of humanity gone. But I can guarantee you in the book of Revelation, the wrath of God being poured out and trumpets and the seals does not impact believers. That impact is all on unbelievers, evil people. That's the book of Revelation. And that's what the left behind is, a preview of the seals and the trumpets and the bowls of wrath. But we interpret it as something totally different and made it kind of our little, escape pod. Okay. What else? Are you all good? Are we clear on these 5 things?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So, if somebody were to ask me about the Great Tribulation, I would tell them exactly what I told you tonight. I cannot find a duration biblically. I think it's real. It happens before Jesus returns. It's going to be super intense. And the purpose is to purify Christians' faith. Christians that survive and go through it and conquer will have their faith purified, and it will result in certain things that go directly to Jesus. Jesus will get honor through our faithfulness. That's the purpose of tribulation and Great Tribulation both. But it's happening already, and it's still going to come harder. Okay. So next week, I'd like to take you into Matthew 24 and show you the signs that Jesus, because he was asked specifically, what are the signs? This gets us now, with this in mind, we have a pretty good reference point to say we can't put these signs into a system. I can't lay these on the timeline for you. And so if we don't have the timeline, we're able to look at the signs as standalones rather than trying to put them in a chronological order. And that's what I'd like to show you next week. All right. Anything else? Good?
Good.
Okay. What's takeaway? What's the one takeaway tonight?
Don't get taken away.
Don't get taken away. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. That
Yeah.
works.
Gathered, not taken.
Okay.
Stay faithful.
Live to glorify God.
Live to glorify. Okay.
Yeah.
And you can't do that without trouble, without tribulation.
So be happy about your tribulations.
Yeah.
Not-
Which is a different kind of happy, isn't it? It's a
Content.
rejoicing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a happy. It's a rejoice. It's an action. Happy.
It's an opportunity.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, my prayer for all of you is that as a result of what God is doing in our life and keeps doing, is that our faith gets stronger and more purified and refined, and that we end up at the front of the line, at least not anywhere back farther than the middle. Okay. I'll settle for the first million, I think, somewhere in that level there. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Have
you.
a
Thank
great
you,
rest
Greg.
of the week.
Greg. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Talk to y'all later.
Bye.
Thanks, Greg.